Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I want to start today with a mental image. Picture a demolition expert.
Okay.
When we think of that, we probably think of, a guy in a hard hat wiring up a building with explosives to bring it down in a controlled implosion.
Right. Dust, noise, crumbling concrete, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. But today, we are talking about a very different kind of demolition expert. We're looking at a man who walked up to one of the biggest, most terrifying structures in human history, the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And he didn't use dynamite. He didn't use a tank.
He used a pen.
He used a pen. And not just a pen, but a very dense, very academic philosophy book, which is, I think, the wildest part of this whole story.
It's an incredible thought, isn't it? That ideas can have that kind of force.
The man we're talking about is Leszek Kołakowski, a man who started his life as a die-hard, card-carrying, true believer communist and ended up writing the definitive work that intellectually dismantled the entire system he once worshipped.
It is a fascinating, almost unbelievable trajectory. And you're not exaggerating about the power of his work. I mean, there are serious historians, serious political scientists who credit Kołakowski with helping to bring about the collapse of the Soviet Empire.
Wow.
Bronislaw Geremek, the Polish historian and politician, he famously called him the Awakener of human hopes.
That's a heavy title, the Awakener. It sounds almost biblical.
It does, and I think it's appropriate. To understand why he earned that title, we have to treat this deep dive not just as a biography. This isn't just about where he was born and where he went to school.
Right.
This is really a case study on the power of ideas. It's about the danger of ideology, the seductive nature of certainty, and, the supreme importance of critical thinking.
Yeah, because Kołakowski isn't just a figure for the history books. As I was reading through the research, I kept thinking, man, this guy is a guide for how to think right now.
Absolutely.
When the world is sort of demanding you just pick a side, pick a team, and obey, Kołakowski is that voice in your ear telling you to ask questions, to be skeptical.
He helps you spot the traps in your own thinking, which is maybe the hardest thing to do.
So our mission today is to track this incredible journey. We need to understand how one man goes from being a Stalinist youth in Poland, and let's be clear, he was arguably a fanatic, to an exiled philosopher at Oxford who becomes the intellectual godfather of the Solidarity movement.
And we're going to unpack some concepts with just fantastic names along the way.
Oh, the names are brilliant. My favorite has to be the law of the infinite cornucopia.
Chuckles. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? But it's actually a profound and slightly terrifying epistemological warning.
And then there's the idolatry of politics, which, honestly, if we have time, I really want to try and apply to our current moment because it feels painfully relevant.
It is incredibly relevant, maybe more than ever.
And of course, the jester in philosophy. I just love that image. But before we get to all that, the high-level philosophy, we have to start in the rubble. We have to go back to the beginning. So section 1, the zealot.
Leszek Kołakowski was born in Radom, Poland in 1927. And to understand the man, you absolutely have to understand the environment that forged him. His education wasn't normal by any stretch. The official records say it was truncated by the German occupation during World War II.
That is such a polite academic way of putting it.
Well,
Truncated. It sounds like he just missed a semester because of a bad flu.
Right. That's not what happened at all. When the Nazis occupied Poland, their goal wasn't just military control. It was cultural eradication. They closed the high schools. They shut down the universities.
I read that the explicit Nazi policy was that Poles only needed to know how to count to 500 and write their own names.
That's it. Anything beyond that was considered dangerous. The goal was to turn an entire nation into a slave class. So you have to put yourself in his shoes.
So if you're a teenager in Poland in, say, 1940, just going to school is a crime. It's a subversive act.
It's an act of resistance. And this is where you see the first real spark of Kołakowski's character. He didn't just accept this. He didn't just stop learning. He entered the completey.
The completey. I saw this term in the notes. It translates to something like completes.
Roughly, yes. It refers to the underground school system. And I really want to pause on this for a second because it sounds romantic, like something out of a movie. But it was terrifying.
This isn't Dead Poet Society.
Not at all. These were small groups of students, maybe 5 or 6 at a time, meeting in secret in private apartments, in kitchens, in freezing basements. The teachers, many of them university professors who had been stripped of their jobs, were risking deportation to concentration camps just to teach Latin or history or mathematics.
It's high-stakes algebra. The risk is immense.
Immense. You have to try and picture the scene. The curtains are drawn. Maybe one student is posted by the window watching the street for German patrols, and they're inside whispering about Plato or geometry while you can hear boots marching on the cobblestones outside.
That creates such a vivid picture for me. The world is literally burning, society is collapsing, and here's this kid so hungry for knowledge that he's sneaking around to get it. It speaks to a serious intellectual drive.
It absolutely does. He passed his final school-leaving examinations as an external student in this underground system. He was reading incessantly. He taught himself languages. He was building this incredible mind under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable.
But here's the paradox, and this is the hard part for us to wrap our heads around today. This brilliant, book-hungry kid who risks his life for what is essentially a liberal education. As soon as the war ends, he walks right into the arms of Stalinism.
Yeah, this is the uncomfortable part of the biography, isn't it? The source material is very blunt about this. It says he wasn't just a casual member, he was a Stalinist. He joined the Association of Fighting Youth in 1945 and then the Polish United Workers' Party in 1947.
True believer.
A true believer. And we have to ask, why? Why does a smart person, someone who values knowledge so much, become a fanatic for a system that would eventually crush that very freedom he sought?
I have to assume it has something to do with the trauma and chaos of the war.
Precisely. You have to look at the psychology of that moment. The world had just been burned to the ground by fascism. The political right, in his eyes, had produced Auschwitz. It had produced the utter destruction of his country.
So anything that stood against that must have looked like the answer.
Exactly. And then the Red Army comes in, promising order, promising science, promising a rational future where everyone is equal and superstition is banished. To a 20-year-old intellectual standing in the ruins of Warsaw, that looked like salvation.
It's the clean slate appeal. Everything that came before was a disaster. We are going to build the perfect world from scratch.
Yes. He saw communism not as a tyranny, but as the triumph of reason over chaos. But his commitment went very deep. There's a specific incident in the files that really stops you in your tracks. It's hard to reconcile with the man he became later.
What was that?
He signed a denunciation of his own professor, a man named Władysław Tatarkiewicz.
Oof, that's intense. Denouncing your own mentor, the guy who taught you philosophy.
It shows the depth of his ideological possession at the time. Tatarkiewicz was a brilliant philosopher, a historian of aesthetics, but he was considered bourgeois. He wasn't Marxist enough for the new regime, and Kołakowski, in his zeal, believed that protecting the purity of the ideology was more important than personal loyalty or gratitude or even truth.
That is cold. It creates a very specific image of him at that time. He wasn't just a follower, he was an enforcer, he was an inquisitor for the new faith.
He was, and that fact is absolutely crucial for the rest of the story because nobody knows the flaws of a religion better than the ex-high priest.
Right.
When he eventually turns on the system, he isn't attacking it from the outside like a Western capitalist might. He knows where all the logical fallacies are. He knows where the bodies are buried because, metaphorically speaking, he helped dig some of the graves.
So he's deep in the pain. He's a party member from 1947 all the way up to 1966. That's nearly 2 decades. But obviously something had to change. You don't go from signing denunciations to becoming the Awakener of hopes overnight. What was the catalyst?
Well, there wasn't one single road to Damascus moment, but there was a specific turning point that started the slide. In 1950, the party recognized his intellectual promise. I mean, he was clearly a brilliant young mind, a rising star. So as a reward, they sent him on a trip.
To Moscow. A reward trip to the mothership.
Exactly. It was intended to cement his loyalty. The idea was, he'll go there, he'll be awed by the Soviet paradise, and he'll come back an even more fervent believer.
But that's not what happened.
It backfired. The reality of a Soviet center shocked him.
The classic never meet your heroes moment, but on a geopolitical scale.
It was worse than that, I think. He saw the poverty. He saw the fear in people's eyes. He saw the cultural stagnation, the intellectual emptiness. Seeing the system up close in its capital didn't inspire him. It horrified him. He realized that the rational utopia he was reading about in books in Warsaw just didn't exist.
So he comes back to Poland with doubts, the first cracks in the faith.
He does. He finishes his PhD in 1953, which, interestingly enough, was on the philosopher Spinoza, written from a Marxist viewpoint, of course. He was still in the system, but the seeds of doubt were planted. And then history gives them a chance to grow.
1956, the Polish October.
Yes. Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev gives his secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, and by 1956, the grip of terror loosens just a little bit across the Eastern Bloc. There's a wave of liberalization in Poland, a thaw.
And Kołakowski seizes this moment.
He does. He breaks publicly with Stalinism. Now, we have to be careful here. He didn't abandon Marxism entirely. Not yet.
Right. The notes say he became what are called a revisionist Marxist.
Exactly. He started advocating for a humanist interpretation of Karl Marx. He was digging back into Marx's early writings, trying to find a version of socialism that wasn't totalitarian.
Okay, let me try to translate that. He's basically saying the original theory is good, the idea is pure, we just implemented it all wrong. He's tried to save the baby from the very, very bloody bathwater.
That's a perfect way to put it. At first, yes, he wanted a socialism with a human face. And this brings us to his next phase, his time as the heretic. This is where the conflict with the state really begins to heat up. He starts critiquing from within.
1 year after that Polish October in 1957, he publishes a 4-part critique in a periodical called Nowa Kultura. And he goes right for the jugular. He attacks Soviet Marxist dogmas, specifically historical determinism.
And this is such a key moment. We need to define historical determinism because it sounds dry and academic, but it was the engine of the entire Soviet state.
It's the core beliefs.
It is. It's the idea that history follows a set, predictable path like a train on a set of tracks, and that communism is the inevitable, scientifically guaranteed final station.
So it's not a choice. It's destiny. It's not politics. It's physics.
It's science. The party claimed that they weren't just politicians making choices. They were scientists enacting the immutable laws of history. And if you attack historical determinism, you're not just disagreeing with the policy, you're saying the train might not be going to the station after all. You're attacking the party's claim to infallibility.
And he was using their own language, their own texts against them.
It was, and that made him so much more dangerous than an outsider. He knew the material better than the censors did. He could quote Marx and Engels to prove that the party was wrong. He was a heretic, not an infidel. But the real break, the point of no return, came a bit later in 1966.
The 10th anniversary lecture.
Yes. He was invited to give a public lecture at Warsaw University on the 10th anniversary of the 1956 Polish October. Now, usually these official anniversaries are for self-congratulations.
Look how great we're doing, comrades. 10 years of glorious progress.
Exactly. Kołakowski got up there and did the precise opposite. He gave a speech where he systematically listed all the promises of 1956 that have been broken. He pointed out the lack of freedom, the continued censorship, the repression. He basically said, we celebrated 10 years ago, but we have absolutely nothing to celebrate today.
That takes some serious nerve. That's not just an academic critique anymore. That's standing up in the lion's den and poking the lion directly in the eye.
It was explosive. The content of that lecture led directly to his expulsion from the Polish United Workers' Party. He had finally crossed a line they couldn't ignore.
And things went downhill very fast for him personally after that. We get to 1968.
The 1968 political crisis in Poland. It was a nasty time. Student protests, government crackdowns, anti-Semitic purges disguised as anti-Zionist campaigns. And in that turmoil, Kołakowski lost his job at Warsaw University.
And it wasn't just you're fired.
No. He was prevented from obtaining any other academic post in the entire country.
They blacklisted him. They tried to starve his mind, to silence him by taking away his platform.
Yes. And this is what forced him into exile. It was a major life-altering pivot. He had to leave his country, his language, his culture behind. But before we get to his life in the West, we absolutely have to talk about that concept you mentioned in the intro, the jester.
Yes, the jester in philosophy. This feels like the key to his whole intellectual personality. It's the role he carves out for himself. Can you unpack that for us?
So Kołakowski wrote a famous essay called The Priest and the Jester. He used these two figures as metaphors for two fundamental ways of thinking, two philosophical stances toward the world.
Okay, so let's start with the priest. Who is the priest?
The priest isn't necessarily a religious figure. The priest is the guardian of the absolute, the guardian of the dogma. The priest says, this is the truth, it is final, it is sacred, and your job is to bow down to it.
So in his context, the Communist Party officials were the priests.
They were the ultimate priests. They maintain the solemnity of the cult, they tell you what to believe, but really any ideology has its priests.
Right. Now contrast that with the jester.
Okay, think about a medieval royal court. Everyone has to follow protocol. Everyone has to bow and scrape and agree with the king. If the king makes a terrible joke, everyone has to laugh, except one person.
The jester. The court fool. He's the only one who can get away with mocking the king.
Right. The jester moves in high society, but he is not of it. He maintains a critical distance. He's the one who's allowed to point out the absurdities. He's the one who says, hey, why is the king naked?
I love that.
And Kołakowski argued that in a totalitarian system, or really in any system that demands total belief, the philosopher's duty is to be the jester.
To question the theology of the state, to be the professional skeptic.
Precisely. The jester asks the banal questions that can make the whole house of cards tumble down. The jester mistrusts anything that claims to be absolute, final, or unquestionable.
It's not about being a contrarian just to be annoying. It's about testing the foundations. It's about poking the walls to see if they're actually made of stone or if they're just painted cardboard.
And Kołakowski realized that if you want to be intellectually free, you have to adopt the attitude of the jester. You have to be willing to laugh at the most sacred truths of your time, and especially your own.
So carrying this jester energy, he leaves Poland. He is in exile. And you would think, okay, he's out. He's safe. Maybe he'll just teach some quiet classes at a Western university and relax. But he didn't do that.
Not at all. He decided to build a bomb.
An intellectual bomb. This brings us to section 3. The magnum opus, main currents of Marxism.
This book is legendary. It was published in 3 volumes between 1976 and 1978. It's well over 1,200 pages. It's a doorstop.
It's a doorstop that creates an earthquake. It is considered one of the most important books of the 20th century. And here's the thing. On the surface, it just looks like a dry academic history book. It analyzes the genealogy of Marxism, going all the way back to Platonism, through Hegel, to Marx himself.
Right. The full title is Main Currents of Marxism. Its Rise, Growth, and Dissolution.
So, again, I have to ask the big question. How does a history book demolish a superpower? Usually you need economic sanctions or an army for that. How does a history book do that kind of damage?
That is the million-dollar question. And to understand the damage, you have to understand the key intellectual defense the Soviets and their Western sympathizers always relied on. Up until the 1970s, many people on the left, especially the new left in the West, argued that Stalinism was a tragic accident.
Right, that wasn't real communism argument. We still hear versions of this today.
Exactly. They would say Marxism is a beautiful scientific theory of human liberation. It just got corrupted by, Russian backwardness or by Stalin's personal paranoia. They tried to separate the dream from the terrible reality. They argued that the Gulag was a mistake, an aberration, a deviation from the true path.
And Kołakowski just wasn't buying that.
Yeah. Kołakowski went back to the source code. He meticulously traced the idea from its very roots, through every mutation, and he proved, step by step, logic gate by logic gate, that Stalinism was not an aberration. He argued it was the logical, predictable, even inevitable outcome of Marxism itself.
That is an absolutely devastating conclusion. He's not saying the bug is in the implementation. He's saying the bug's in the core operating system.
That's it exactly. And he did this by deconstructing the core concepts, like dialectical materialism.
Okay, hold on. Dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
That is a mouthful. Can you explain it? Like, I'm 5 on that because I know it's central to this whole thing.
All right, I'll try. In short, Marxists believed that history isn't random. They believed it moves according to scientific laws, specifically the laws of class conflict. That's the materialism part. Matter, the economy, drives everything. The dialectical part is the idea that history moves forward through a clash of opposites, like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But the key takeaway is this. They believed that just like gravity makes an apple fall, these historical laws guarantee that capitalism will collapse and communism will rise. It's not a guess. It's science.
And if it's science, you can't argue with it. You don't argue with the law of gravity.
Exactly. This was the source of their political and moral power. If the party is the keeper of that science, then the party is never wrong. If the party says you have to liquidate the kulaks or build a gulag, it's not an atrocity. It's a scientific necessity. It justifies anything because science says it's required for the glorious future.
And Kołakowski took a sledgehammer to this foundation.
He took a scalpel to it. He was a surgeon. He analyzed these so-called laws one by one and showed they were mostly gibberish. He concluded that some of them were just truisms with no specific Marxist content, meaning they were just obvious statements like people need to eat to survive, dressed up in fancy language.
Juckles.
And the others, he said, were philosophical dogmas that cannot be proved by scientific means. He even dismissed some parts of the ideology as just plain nonsense.
So he exposed the science as a mythology. He showed that the emperor of ideology had no clothes.
Precisely. And once you prove that Marxism isn't a science, the party loses its divine right to rule. They aren't scientists anymore. They're just dictators with a bad and very dangerous theory.
And again, this was so devastating because Kołakowski knew the material better than the ideologues themselves. He wasn't some capitalist attacking from the outside. He was dismantling it from the inside, showing that the internal logic ultimately led not to freedom, but to totalitarian slavery.
He stripped away the intellectual legitimacy of the Soviet Union. After Kołakowski published this book, you couldn't really be a serious intellectual and defend the Soviet system as scientific with a straight face anymore. He changed the entire debate.
So he is in exile writing this massive system-crushing book. Where was he physically during all of this? Where did he land?
Well, after leaving Poland in '68, he became a bit of a global roamer for a while. He was a visiting professor at McGill in Montreal. Then he went to the University of California, Berkeley in 1969.
1969 Berkeley.
Mm.
I mean, wow. That must have been a massive culture shock for a guy who just fled a communist dictatorship.
It was, and it was another pivotal experience for him. He got there and he saw the student protests in the West. He saw the new left in America chanting Marxist slogans, carrying posters of Mao and Ho Chi Minh.
Praising the very ideologies he had just risked his life to escape from. That must have been infuriating.
It was more than infuriating, it was disillusioning. He saw these, privileged students in a free and prosperous society advocating for the exact system that had destroyed his country and forced him into exile. He realized they didn't understand the reality of what they were cheering for.
He didn't have much patience for what you might call recreational revolutionaries.
No, he didn't. He famously called them out for their conceptual sloppiness. That experience caused him to abandon any lingering sympathies for the new left entirely. After that, he finally settled in a more permanent role at Oxford, becoming a fellow at All Souls College. He also spent time as a visiting professor at Yale and the University of Chicago, but Oxford really became his intellectual home.
But even from the quiet halls of Oxford, he wasn't done with Poland. He wasn't just an academic historian. This brings us to Section 4, the strategist. Because he didn't just criticize the past, he offered a practical path forward for the future.
This is where we really see him become the awakener of human hopes. In 1971, he published an incredibly influential essay. Its title was Theses on Hope and Hopelessness.
And what was the core idea there? What was so hopeful about it?
To understand the importance of this essay, you have to understand the mood in the Eastern Bloc in the early 70s. It was one of pure despair. People believed the Soviet system was permanent, unchangeable. It was a monolith. It had tanks. It had the secret police. It had nuclear weapons.
The feeling was, you can't fight it, so just keep your head down and try to survive.
Exactly. The old joke. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. There was this sense of total paralysis, and Kołakowski's essay challenged that head-on. He argued that the system was rigid, yes, but it was not invincible. He proposed a strategy of sustained social pressure.
What does that look like in practice? What is social pressure against a tank?
He argued that you don't have to plan for some grand, bloody revolution to overthrow the government tomorrow. That was a fantasy. Instead, he said, self-organized social groups could gradually extend civil society, even within the confines of a totalitarian state.
So you carve out spaces where government doesn't rule. You create your own little pockets of freedom.
That's it. You create your own independent trade unions, your own underground newspapers, the samizdat culture, your own discussion clubs, your own flying universities.
It's like salami tactics, but in reverse. Instead of the state taking freedom away slice by slice, the people start taking it back slice by slice.
Precisely. And this essay, Theses on Hope and Hopelessness, provided the intellectual blueprint for the dissident movements of the 1970s in Poland. It directly inspired the formation of groups like the Workers' Defense Committee, or KOR, and eventually the massive Solidarity movement.
So Solidarity, this huge trade union movement led by Lech Wałęsa that eventually brought down the government, was basically running on Kołakowski's intellectual operating system.
To a very large extent, yes. The historian Timothy Garton Ash noted that another of Kołakowski's essays, a 1978 manifesto called How to Be a Conservative Liberal Socialist, perfectly prefigured the strange ideological mix of Solidarity.
Wait, hold on. Pause on that title. How to Be a Conservative Liberal Socialist. That sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. In modern politics, those are three different teams that spend all their time fighting each other.
It does, doesn't it? But Kołakowski, in his genius, saw that to effectively fight totalitarianism, you needed elements of all three.
Okay, you have to break that down for me. How does that work?
Well, he said you need to be a conservative because you need to value things the communists tried to erase, tradition, national history, and especially in Poland, religion, and the Catholic Church.
Okay, that makes sense.
You need to be a liberal because you need to value the individual against the state. You need to fight for human rights, free speech, and the rule of law.
And a socialist.
And you need to be a socialist because you need to care about social justice, solidarity, and the dignity and welfare of the workers who are being exploited by the party elite.
That is fascinating. He was synthesizing all these seemingly opposing views into a coherent weapon against the state.
And that is exactly what the Solidarity movement was. It was a trade union, that's the socialist part, fighting for human rights and democracy, the liberal part, and it was all done with the strong backing and symbolism of the Catholic Church, the conservative part.
And he didn't just write about it from his armchair in Oxford. In 1975, he was a signatory of the Letter of 59, protesting changes to the Polish constitution. And in the 80s, he was constantly giving interviews, raising funds, and writing tirelessly to support solidarity from abroad.
There's a fantastic quote here from him analyzing the revolution of 1980-81, and it just perfectly highlights the deep irony of the whole situation. In his article, What is Left of Socialism, he wrote that the events in Poland were the closest thing to a genuine working-class revolution that the 20th century ever saw.
Which is exactly what Karl Marx predicted would happen.
But, and here's the jester's twist, it was a revolution of industrial workers directed against the socialist state, and it was carried out under the sign of the cross with the blessing of a Polish pope.
The ultimate jester move. The workers of the world united, but they united against the communists, holding crucifixes. Marx must have been spinning in his grave.
It completely shattered the entire Marxist narrative. The workers didn't want a communist state to save them, they wanted freedom from it.
Let's move on then, to Section 5, the philosopher of modernity. Because Kołakowski wasn't just a political thinker, not just an anti-communist. In his later years, he went much deeper into the human condition itself. And I want to jump to one of his later concepts because, honestly, this one kept me up last night. It feels less like 1970s philosophy and more like a direct commentary on my Twitter feed.
Chuckles, I think I know exactly which one you mean.
The law of the infinite cornucopia.
It is my absolute favorite Kołakowski concept. It's so powerful.
Cornucopia means a horn of plenty, right? An endless supply of stuff.
Right. So the law of the infinite cornucopia states, for any given doctrine, there is an infinite supply of supportive arguments.
Okay, let's really unpack that, because normally we think that if we have evidence for our beliefs, then we're right. If I can list 50 reasons why my political party is the best, doesn't that prove my point?
Kołakowski says absolutely not. And this is the deep trap of ideology. He realized that once you are truly committed to a worldview, whether it's Marxism or a specific religion or a modern conspiracy theory, your mind acts like a magnet for confirmation. You will naturally find, select, and interpret everything as proof of your belief.
It's confirmation bias on steroids.
It's deeper than just bias. It's about the infinite malleability of logic itself. Let's take a simple non-political example. Let's say you believe that the number 13 is unlucky.
Okay.
If you trip on the sidewalk on Friday the 13th, proof, the number is cursed. But what if you win a small prize on the 13th? The evil forces of the number tried to trick me with a small victory to make me lower my guard for the big disaster that's coming.
You can't lose. Any of it can be twisted to fit the theory.
You can never, ever lose. The cornucopia never runs empty. There's always another argument you can invent, another dot you can connect. Kołakowski was warning us that consistency is not the same thing as truth. You can have a perfectly consistent, logically coherent system that is completely detached from reality.
That is terrifyingly relevant to the internet age. We all live inside our own personalized infinite cornucopias now. You can go online and find 10,000 articles and 100 YouTube videos supporting literally any viewpoint you want to hold.
Precisely. And that's why Kołakowski is so vital for the modern listener. He teaches us that just having an argument, or even a lot of arguments, isn't enough. The real intellectual virtue is the ability to step outside your own cornucopia and ask, could I be wrong? How would I know if I was?
Which brings us right back to the jester. The jester is the only one who knows that the cornucopia is a magic trick.
That's it, exactly.
This deep skepticism also ties into another major work of his later life, his 1986 Jefferson lecture, which was titled The Idolatry of Politics.
Yes, this is another crucial concept for our times. He warned against the profound danger of thinking that politics can solve everything. The idolatry is when we turn a political ideology or the state itself into a religion, when we expect government to provide not just roads and schools, but ultimate meaning, purpose, and total happiness.
We want our politicians to be our saviors. We want the state to be our church.
And Kołakowski said that is a direct path to disaster. Because the state is just a tool. It's a human mechanism. It cannot provide spiritual salvation. When it tries, it becomes monstrous. He asserted, and this is a fantastic quote, "We learn history not in order to know how to behave, but to know who we are."
That's a subtle but really important distinction. History isn't a manual for success. It's a mirror for identity.
And as he got older, he turned more and more towards questions of religion and transcendence. Not necessarily in a dogmatic way. He wasn't a traditional Catholic in the strict sense, but he became very interested in the theological assumptions that underpin Western culture.
The source material mentions he defended freedom of will and the human quest for the transcendent.
He did. He came to believe that the pursuit of truth and goodness, with capital letters, was what ennobled human life. Even if we humans are frail, even if we can never be infallible or perfect, the striving itself matters. He moved from the arrogant certainty of his Stalinist youth, where he thought he had all the answers, to a kind of faithful skepticism in his old age. He learned to embrace the mystery.
It's a beautiful and humbling intellectual arc. From the young man who thinks he can build heaven on earth with a gun and a manifesto, to the old man who understands that the unending quest for the answer is what truly makes us human.
And the world eventually recognized this monumental contribution. This brings us to Section 6, his legacy and honors. Kołakowski was, in many ways, the king of philosophy by the end of his life.
He was the first ever winner of the John W. Kluge Prize in 2003. That's a prize given by the U.S. Library of Congress. It's basically the Nobel Prize for fields that the Nobel doesn't cover, like history and philosophy.
And it came with a $1 million award. When they announced it, James Dillington, the Librarian of Congress at the time, said Kołakowski's voice was fundamental for the fate of Poland and influential in Europe as a whole.
He also won a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, the Erasmus Prize, the Jerusalem Prize, the Order of the White Eagle, which is Poland's highest honor. The list just goes on and on.
It really does. But I think the most telling tribute, the one that really captures the spirit of the man, came from the British philosopher Roger Scruton after Kołakowski died in 2009.
What did he say?
Scruton wrote that even Kołakowski's opponents, people whose ideas he had completely dismantled, didn't feel damaged in their ego by his arguments.
That is a rare and incredible skill. Usually when someone demolishes your entire worldview, you feel attacked, you feel stupid, you get defensive.
But Kołakowski had a way of dissecting the idea without destroying the person. It speaks to that jester spirit again. It was never about malice or showing off how smart he was. It was always about the pursuit of truth. He was gentle with people, but absolutely ruthless with bad ideas.
He died in Oxford in 2009 at the age of 81, but he was buried back in Warsaw at the Pulaski Military Cemetery. He came home in the end.
Adam Michnik, another legendary Polish dissident and writer, called him one of the most prominent creators of contemporary Polish culture. And when you look at the source material, you see this incredible bibliography that spans decades. Over 30 books, Main Currents of Marxism, Modernity on Endless Trial, God Owes Us Nothing. He was just relentlessly prolific.
So let's try to synthesize this whole incredible story. We have a boy who learned in secret basements during the Nazi occupation. A young man who fell for the false promise of Stalinism because he desperately wanted a rational, ordered world. A scholar who then went to the heart of the beast in Moscow and saw the ugly truth.
And then an exile who used his pen, his mind, and his integrity to give intellectual ammunition and a strategic blueprint to one of the most important freedom movements of the entire 20th century.
It really is a testament to the power of the mind. Kołakowski showed that totalitarianism is ultimately built on lies. It relies on people accepting the official infinite cornucopia of propaganda. And if you can expose those lies, methodically, historically, philosophically, you weaken the chains.
He didn't just stand up and shout, "Communism is bad." He showed with immense erudition why it was philosophically bankrupt from its very foundations.
And he did it all with that jester spirit, that willingness to challenge the high priests of dogma.
And that, I think, is the lasting lesson for us. We all have our dogmas. We all have our priests, whether they're in politics or in our culture or just in our own social circles. Kołakowski challenges us to be the jester in the room, to ask the awkward question, to maintain that healthy, critical distance.
And to be deeply, deeply wary of our own infinite cornucopia. Just because you have 1,000 arguments for your side doesn't mean you have the truth.
Exactly. The strength of your belief is not evidence of its truth.
So here is a provocative thought to leave you with then. Reflecting on that law of the infinite cornucopia. If any doctrine, no matter how crazy, can find an infinite supply of arguments to support itself. How do we ever know for sure when we are wrong?
That is the question, isn't it? And perhaps the answer isn't in finding more arguments for our own side, but in having the courage and the humility to laugh at our uncertainty.
Find your inner jester, everyone. Thanks for listening to this deep dive into the life and thought of Leszek Kołakowski. We will see you next time.